Look up at an old London townhouse, or dozens more like it scattered across Britain. And one of the windows isn't a window at all, just flat brick, sitting exactly where the glass should be, staring out at the street like a blind eye. It looks like a builder's mistake. It isn't. That blank grey rectangle is a receipt, a confession, and a small act of rebellion, all at the same time. Because for a long stretch of this country's history, the government did something that still sounds impossible the moment you say it aloud. It taxed daylight. This is the story of how ordinary people in London around the year 1700 actually handed over their taxes, where the money went, who came knocking, and the strange, clever, sometimes wonderfully petty ways they tried to keep it. Stay with me, because by the end, I don't think you'll ever look at an old brick wall the same way again. Step onto a London street in the cold months of that year, and the first thing to reach you isn't a sight. It's the smell. Coal smoke, thick and low, pressing down over the rooftops. River mud and salt drifting up from a half-frozen Thames. Somewhere close by, roasting chestnuts and horse dung and wet wool, all fighting for the same lungful of air. The city is still dressing itself in pale new stone after the great fire of a generation earlier, and up on the scaffolding of a rising cathedral, an old architect named Christopher Wren stands squinting at his dome as it climbs, at last, toward the sky. Here is the uncomfortable secret sitting underneath all that ambition. England is very nearly out of money. For years, the country has been locked in enormous, ruinously expensive wars across the Channel against the France of Louis XIV, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Armies cost coin, navies cost far more, and a small island kingdom simply did not have the cash lying about to pay for all of it. To keep those armies fed and those ships afloat, in 1694, a handful of merchants and the Crown tried something that had never really existed on this scale before. They founded the Bank of England, not to help you, but to lend money to the government so it could keep fighting. Investors put in well over £1 million, an almost unimaginable sum, and the state promised to pay it back with interest. Much of this new world of money was being invented not in palaces, but in the city's coffee houses, smoky, crowded rooms where merchants read the news and traded the first shares. One of them, Jonathan's, in a lane called Exchange Alley, is a direct ancestor of the London Stock Exchange, and that arrangement with the bank is the seed of something we are all still living inside today, the national debt. Britain owes money to this very hour, and the machine that made it possible was switched on in a coffee house in the middle of a war. Borrowed money buys you time. It does not buy you escape. Sooner or later, every one of those glittering loans had to be repaid, and there was only one place the money could ever truly come from. You. To understand just how much people dreaded the taxman by 1700, you have to meet the tax they had only recently gotten rid of, the Hearth tax. Brought in under Charles II back in 1662, it was almost cheerfully simple in theory. 2 shillings a year for every hearth, every fireplace in your home. More fires, more money owed. Fair enough, except for the part everyone loathed. To count your hearths, a man had to come inside your house. Picture it. A stranger, a stiff-collared official the people nicknamed the chimney man, stepping over your threshold, walking through your rooms, peering into your kitchen and your bedchamber, counting the very fires that kept your children warm. In a world with no privacy laws and no polite knock and wait, this felt like a violation of the one place that was supposed to be yours alone. People hid hearths behind false walls. Some knocked a chimney through to a neighbour so 2 households could share one. It bred resentment the way damp breeds mould. When William of Orange and his wife Mary took the throne in the upheaval of 1689, one of the very first things they did was scrap the hearth tax entirely, and they made sure everyone knew it was a gift, a way to buy a nervous nation's affection. It worked beautifully, but a government that surrenders one tax still needs the money, which meant someone, somewhere, had to dream up a cleverer one. That someone arrived in 1696, the idea was almost elegant in its sneakiness. If the trouble with the old tax was that officials had to barge into your home to count your fires, then design a tax you could measure without ever stepping through the door, stand in the street, look up, and count the windows. The more windows a house had, the more its owner paid. Below a certain number, you paid only a small basic rate. Above it, the charge climbed, band by band. It was, on paper, genuinely brilliant. Windows were easy to see, impossible to hide, and roughly matched to wealth. Grand houses had glass everywhere, poor cottages had almost none. The assessor never had to meet you, he simply had to count. And this is where the people of England did something that makes me grin every time. If windows cost money, they got rid of the windows. Up and down the country, homeowners hauled in bricks and mortar and sealed their own windows shut, dropping their houses down into a cheaper band. Whole upper floors went dark on purpose. Landlords bricked up the windows in the rooms they rented to the poor, so their tenants sat in gloom to save the owner a few shillings a year. Those bricked-up windows never fully came back. That is exactly why, even now, if you walk the older streets of Bath, or Edinburgh, or London, and actually look up, you'll spot them. Neat rectangles of brick where glass should be, 3 centuries old, still quietly telling on the taxman. I've stood on a terrace in Bath myself and counted 7 of them in a single row. And there's a phrase a great many people still swear was born right here, in the sheer irritation of paying for your own sunlight. Daylight robbery. Now, word historians argue over whether the tax really gave us that expression. I'm not fully convinced it did, but you can absolutely see why people believed it. Here's where I have to be honest with you about how I actually feel. The window tax was, to me, one of the sneakiest ideas any government has ever had. Genuinely clever and genuinely a little bit cruel. Taxing light and air, the 2 things nobody on earth should ever have to buy. So let's settle it, you and me, right here. If you think there's something almost admirable in a scheme that neat, a grudging tip of the hat to whoever dreamed it up, then tap that like button as your salute to the cleverest taxman in history. But if you think there is nothing clever about charging people for the sun, that it was mean and nothing more, then don't you dare like a thing. Go straight down to the comments and tell me I've lost the plot. I'll happily read both sides. Windows were only ever the part you could see. The taxes that quietly drained the most from an ordinary Londoner's purse were the ones hiding inside almost everything they bought. These were the excise taxes, duties baked into the price of everyday goods long before the coins ever left your hand. Beer and ale were taxed. Salt was taxed, which meant even preserving your food through the winter cost you extra. Soap was taxed, and candles, and malt, and leather. Sit with that for a moment. The tallow candle you lit to see by after dark, the soap you washed with, the salt that kept your meat from spoiling. The state had quietly taken its slice of all of it before you had even carried it home. To collect it, an army of officials fanned out across the country, the excise men who inspected the brewers and the soap boilers and the salt makers, measuring, weighing, calculating what was owed. Nobody liked them, nobody. Half a century after our story, a famous scholar named Samuel Johnson would still be so irritated by the whole business that when he compiled his great dictionary, he defined the word excise as a hateful tax, judged not by proper courts, but by men hired for the purpose. When the official definition of a tax is an open insult, you can guess how the public felt. If taxing your soap and your candles sounds like reaching far, wait until you hear what came next. In 1695, Parliament passed an act so sweeping it almost defies belief. It put a tax on being born, a tax on getting married, a tax on being buried, and, my personal favourite, a tax on simply being an unmarried man. If you were a bachelor past the age of 25 or a childless widower, the state charged you extra, essentially, for the crime of staying single. Cradle to grave, quite literally, with a bill waiting at every stage. There was one more road the taxman travelled, and it came in by ship. Down at the docks along the Thames, every barrel and bale arriving from abroad met the customs officers first, and their duties were steep. Tea, tobacco, wine, silk, brandy. The luxuries a growing city craved were precisely the things the government leaned on hardest, which tore open a beautiful roaring loophole. If the tax on your cup of tea or your evening glass was that punishing, well, why pay it at all? All along the coasts of Kent and Cornwall, an entire shadow economy came to life. On a moonless night, a boat noses onto a lonely beach. Lanterns are hooded. Kegs of untaxed brandy and bales of tea move hand to hand up the shingle, past inland through a chain of ordinary villagers who have learned the great art of asking no questions. For a long stretch of the century, an enormous share of the tea actually drunk in England had never once seen a customs house. Smuggling wasn't some rare crime out on the fringes. For a huge share of the country, it was simply how you afforded the good stuff, quietly dodging the duty and drinking rather well while they did it. Towering over every one of these, though, stood the true giant, the land tax. Introduced in 1692, it became for decades the single most important source of the government's income in wartime. If you owned land or property or certain kinds of wealth, you were assessed. And in the hardest years of war, the rate could climb to something like 4 shillings for every pound of value. That is roughly a fifth of the reckoned worth of your estate, gone year after year straight into the war chest. And this giant wasn't collected by some distant, faceless ministry. It was done locally by your neighbours. Respectable men of each district were appointed commissioners and assessors, and it fell to them to knock on the doors of the very people they lived amongst, judge the value of their land and homes, and write down what each one owed. See the parish assessor on a raw morning, breath clouding white in the cold, ledger tucked under one arm, walking a lane he has known his entire life, pausing at each gate to reckon what a man can be pressed for. He knows these families. He knows who has fallen on hard times and who is quietly sitting on a good harvest. That is the strange intimacy of tax in this age. It wasn't strangers taxing strangers. It was your own town keeping its own accounts in ink and candlelight. But once all of it was gathered in, the window duty, the excise, the customs, the land tax, where did the money go, and how on earth did anyone keep track of it before receipts and ledgers as we know them? The answer is one of the most wonderful and most absurd things in the whole history of English money. Wood. For centuries, the great treasury at Westminster, the Exchequer, recorded its debts and its payments not on paper, but on notched sticks of willow and hazel, a tally stick. When money was owed or paid, a clerk cut notches into the wood to mark the sum, the width of each cut standing for pounds, shillings, and pence. Then, and this is the clever heart of it, they split the stick lengthways, straight down the middle, through every single notch. One half was handed to you, the other stayed with the treasury. To prove a payment was real, you simply slid the two halves back together. If the notches lined up, it was genuine. A wooden receipt that literally could not be forged, because only your exact matching half would ever fit. And those two pieces carried names that never left us. The larger part, kept by the person who was owed money, was called the stock. Hold one of those, and you were, quite literally, a stockholder, the very word we still use for anyone who holds a share of something valuable. The smaller matching piece was the foil, kept as a check against the original. And that, so the story goes, is where we get counterfoil, the little stub you tear from a checkbook or a raffle ticket even today. I've held one of these old tallies in an archive and felt slightly dizzy that the wealth of a whole kingdom once rested on notches cut into willow. And the tally sticks hand us my favourite twist in the whole story, one that lands long after 1700, but is far too good to leave out. By the 1830s, the Exchequer had finally abandoned carving wood and found itself sitting on centuries' worth of old tally sticks, cartloads of them, packed into the cellars beneath Parliament. Someone decided the tidiest way to be rid of them was to feed the lot into the furnaces under the House of Lords. In 1834, that is exactly what they did. The overloaded furnaces grew far too hot, the flues caught, and the fire climbed out of all control until it had taken almost the entire old Palace of Westminster with it. The grand Parliament building tourists photograph today, clock tower, river frontage and all, is the replacement. It stands there because the government tried to burn its old tax receipts and accidentally burned down Parliament instead. I have honestly tried to picture the meeting where someone said, "Let's just burn 2 centuries of bone-dry firewood in the basement. What's the worst that could happen?" If you can imagine how on earth that conversation actually went, take it down to the comments. I would genuinely love to read your version. Let's come back, though, to the ordinary person, because that is who all of this truly landed on. And it's worth pausing on something quiet and a little sad underneath all the cleverness. Every one of these taxes fell hardest on the people who had the least. The rich, in their grand houses, could pay a few shillings for their many windows and shrug it away. When salt and candles were taxed, it was the labouring family, counting every last penny, who felt it in their bones. Tax in this age wasn't only about money. It shaped the light people lived in, the food they could keep, the very air inside their rooms. And people did not simply bow their heads and accept it. There were protests and unrest against the excise and constant everyday resistance. The hidden hearth, the bricked window, the smuggled keg, the harvest not quite fully declared. This was also a moment when the very coins in your pocket had gone wrong. Around 1696, so many silver coins had been trimmed and clipped at the edges that money itself was becoming unreliable, and the government launched a huge recoinage to put it right. The man placed in charge of the Royal Mint through that crisis was, of all people, Isaac Newton, yes, that Newton, who set aside gravity and comets to hunt down the schemers debasing the nation's coin. The mind that mapped the heavens spent its later years guarding the value of a single shilling. I find that genuinely stunning every time I sit with it. The same man, the falling apple, and the mint. Step back far enough from all these windows and candles and willow sticks, and something much larger swims into focus. What was really being built in London around 1700 wasn't merely a set of maddening taxes. It was a whole new kind of state. For the first time, a government was borrowing vast sums against the promise of future taxes, carrying a permanent debt, funding professional armies and a mighty navy, and reaching into nearly every corner of daily life to pay for it. Historians sometimes call this the birth of the modern fiscal state, the money machine that would go on to power Britain's astonishing rise across the next 2 centuries. Every empire needs coin before it ever needs cannon. And the quiet, unglamorous business of the window tax and the excise man is precisely where that coin was found. The The window tax, as it happens, was no brief experiment. It clung on and on and on. It was still being collected more than 150 years later and only finally abolished in 1851 after doctors and reformers argued, correctly, that forcing people to wall up their windows was making them ill, starving whole homes of the light and fresh air that keep a person healthy. It took this country a century and a half to concede that taxing daylight might not have been such a bright idea after all. And no, I won't be apologizing for that one. So much of that vanished world is still quietly with us. The bank founded to fund a war still stands at the very heart of London. The national debt that began in a coffee house is still ticking upward as you watch this. The rebuilt Parliament exists because of a fire started by old tax receipts. The words stockholder and counterfoil live on in our banks and our habits. And on 1,000 old streets, those bricked-up windows are still keeping their 300-year-old secret in plain sight for anyone who thinks to glance up. This is the kind of history I love most of all, not the crowns and the great battles, but the strange machinery of ordinary life, the receipts and the loopholes and the small, stubborn dignity of people refusing, quietly, to pay for sunshine. If you feel that pull too, then come and stand beside me here at Arthur's Living History and subscribe so that the next time I go wandering off into some forgotten corner of the past, you're right there with me. And I truly do want to know, tell me down in the comments what surprised you most today, or which overlooked little scrap of history you'd like me to walk into next. I read far more of them than you would ever guess. Because the past, you'll find, is never really spent. It's only lent. And sooner or later, it always comes due.